is very almost unspiritual, because in introducing everything that has to be introduced, I won't get a chance to get into any of the spiritual material. We're talking about the sangreal. Sangria meaning blood, and grail means the blood cup, literally what it means. And let's sort of review what we've done. When we first began this year, we began really simply. We started just giving a few fairy tales and simple myths that showed the simple formula of heroism. And then we began to look into the work that was done in heroism, which we're saying that the hero is the initiate. The hero is one that is commencing to unfold the inner spiritual powers, the seership, the creative or magical abilities, and to use them in the service of both God and humanity. Then we began looking a little bit at the evolutionary work of initiation, showing how the evolutionary principles that are behind the cosmos are also within each human from all of our past lives and past states. And therefore, since we are miniatures or microcosms of the universe, that as we become like the whole process of evolution. And in that we've looked a lot at the cosmological side of heroism and of initiation. Now, lately, for the last few weeks, we've been looking more at the philosophy, psychology, and social problems involved in initiation, and most especially in that most difficult of all problems, the problem of self. How can one self-consciously become divine and self-consciously follow the spiritual path? Because that very self-consciousness falls or flies right in the face of selfishness. That is what brought us to our fallen state that requires redemption, initiatory and otherwise. And how can one consciously give up the attachment to selfhood or the preoccupation with selfishness and gain a viewpoint that is much different than the personal point of view? As we've gone along, we've become more far-ranging, wide-ranging with each series that we've taken up, and we've become more complex. And that in itself presents a problem, and that is the problem of complexity in our lives. True, we are responsible for every little deed and every little thing that we omit in our lives, but our lives are also bound up in God. And so that as we follow the initiatory path, we run into that enormous dilemma or dichotomy of at the same time finding significance and meaning in the littlest of all things, and yet at the same time, on the other pole, coming closer and closer to the divine. And as we do so, our consciousness becomes more universal and it becomes more simplified until all there is love and light. And so our greater future is involved probably in unification and simplification. And probably a great deal more is put into the voluntary unification of self with others, so that we become synonymous in spirit with anyone that we commune with, even to the divine. So for our last kind of myth that we're looking into the quest myth. Because the quest myth is the type of myth that is almost always shared. In a way, every myth is a quest myth. It's a quest for spirituality or some facet thereof. But in a quest myth, the activity is especially a shared activity. And there are always a number of heroes. And this number of heroes usually complements each other in some way, and they form something like a whole. It's really quite interesting to me, for example, that even in those latter books of Carlos Castaneda, that even in there, as they come to the stages where they actually start unfolding an inner world consciousness, that they themselves form a unit, that there is a group of them, and there is a geometry almost like a tree of life that the Kabbalists and the tarot people like so much. They form that kind of a group. So we're going to look at a myth that is filled with many heroes, and it is filled with a few anti-heroes and villains as well. Now, the quest myth is not to be confused with a epic journey, because those are two different kinds of things. For example, the Iliad is a quest myth, but the Odyssey is an epic journey. In the Iliad, all of the chieftains and heroes of Greece combine to go against Troy, and the gods are fighting on different sides. Whereas in the Odyssey, the mercurial hero Odysseus wanders all alone for 12 years after the war is over. Another quest myth that we could have looked at was the myth of the Golden Fleece, when Heracles and a number of other people accompanied Jason in the quest for the Golden Fleece. Now from here I think we get a little intellectually abstract. I'll talk a little bit about some points that quest myths have in common with each other. The first one is that there is a strong common objective for all of the heroes involved. And the common objective is something that engages all of them and is something that grabs their attention completely. But even though the object of the quest myth is something that's singular, it is not something that's exclusive, which is to say that the participants in the quest myth do not try to eliminate each other in order to attain to that object, but instead they usually fortify each other because a special kind of teamwork comes out and they are brought to work together. And that is the second objective or the second criterion that all the quest myths share. They have cooperation, and they have teamwork, and they become a unity. Even though sometimes along the way it's a little begrudging, but it eventually ends up becoming a close teamwork. And the third thing that almost all the quest myths have that are an accentuation of any kind of hero myth, and that is quest myths usually occur at the changing, at a great changing of times, when society is changing greatly or when spiritual attitudes are changing greatly, and the quest myth has to do with the finding of the new value or the new goal for society, and the heroes then represent not only great initiates, but the fact that they themselves are seeking out something new, a heretofore unknown symbol or objective, shows that they lead focus on new objectives. So we're going to look at the Sangreal, and the Sangreal is one section from a very large mythical cycle that has a number of sources, and many of them disagree with each other. And it is the myth of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. We are going to rely a lot on one of the more mythical versions and not one of the super historical versions. We're going to rely on Sir Thomas Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur, which was taken from an earlier collection of French works, because it's very hard telling whether this myth is English or French. The earliest existing manuscript is the Winchester manuscript. If you're interested in that, you can actually go and see it. Some people go out of their way to see it because, I don't know, once you've been bitten by the Grail bug or by the Arthur bug, you almost certainly want to do that. And the presentation that we're going to give is extremely brief, because even on the Sangreal, we could probably spend 2 or 3 months talking, and on the whole cycle of the Arthurian Knights, we could probably spend a year or 2. We're going to just breeze through this, yes.
When you're bitten by the Grail bug, is that arthritis?
Yeah, good line. I like it. Yes, I have a friend that, Gary, he's read everything from, he's read all of the Tennyson and the King Arthur in, or Connecticut Yankee in the Court of King Arthur, and he's read even the science fiction versions of the Arthurian Knights. I think he's probably read about 15 or 20. He's the one that should be giving these talks, because he's dedicated his whole life to the study of Arthur. So, as usual, I've bitten off more than I can chew, and I'm just going to spit out something that's only partially digested and hope that there's enough in there so that you can get excited and read it all yourself. So we're going to look at the Sangreal section. You can get a lot of versions. A really simplified version that is quite nice. It doesn't have all of the symbolism in, but it doesn't have all of those battles and battles, is the Bullfinch version. Bullfinch not only did the ancient myths, he did quite a few of the medieval and Dark Age romances. So I like the Bullfinch a lot. You can get through it in a really big hurry. This is definitely a myth that is different than anything we've looked at so far, because it has a lot of Christian and Masonic symbolism in it, and symbolism that is very intentionally different than anything we've seen before. It's almost studiedly different to present, it is one of those quest myths, and with a quest myth you look at things in a different light. So it does have some of the symbols that we've seen in the last couple of years. It has explicit references in critical places to piebald horses, as we found in the myth of Susanalo and in the Elephantine Mysteries last year. And there are also a lot of spiritual concepts behind this myth. And the whole of Arthurian, even just the ancient Arthurian writings, is enormously complex. There are a lot of spin-offs, and there are a lot of epicycles, and loads of interpretations. There are historical interpretations. Mark and I, a few years ago, were reading the Mary Stuart historical interpretation, and before that, I don't know, you've read the one from Future King, which is a psychoanalytical interpretation, and then there was the feminist interpretation, and all of those. But it's really interesting. It's a live myth in some ways, because it's got a lot of things in that grab your attention and thing we'll do is look at the large story, but very much in abstract, and some of the main characters and such like that. In order to do this, when I start off, I went through these notes, I didn't know what I was doing. I came up with something I wouldn't have expected in the first place. But that's all it is. We'll probably be very short tonight, maybe even only one side of the tape. That's unbelievable to you. One of the primary characteristics or principles that runs throughout the entire myth, the whole cycle of the myth, is a very Christian notion, and that is the principle of equality, in that everybody is in some spiritual way, especially in moral things, equal to everyone else. Now, mind you, this is a story about kings and counts and noblemen and pages and common vassals and people like that. And even though there is that kind of political and social hierarchy, there is skill and equality. And even though there is a hierarchy or a pecking order among the knights themselves as to who can defeat who and who has the greater honor about them, there still is an equality. This equality is symbolized in the round table. In this case, looks almost square. The round table was fashioned by one of the central people in the early part of the mythical cycle, Merlin, the wizard magician. Wizard comes from an Arabic word, Wizard, who was the chief advisor to the Caliph, who was the defender of the faith. And the Wizard was the one that had all of the knowledge of the outer and inner worlds and was capable of holding counsel. In many ways, the Wizard and the Caliph, or the king and his wizard, are sort of like a theme that we've looked at all along, that is the sacred spiritual king and the Tanist, the one taking care of the inner spiritual work, the other being the outer political material king. There is a lot of evidence to indicate that the circle of the round table is not merely the table around which the knights sat. Clearly, the reason for the round table, as given by Arthur and Merlin, is that they didn't want knights sitting at different tables from each other, and they didn't want to have one end of the table be more exclusive than the other end of the table, and therefore, if they had a round table, everybody within the circle, every degree of the circle is equal to every other degree, there would be an ultimate unity in the brotherhood of the round table. And in this whole notion, then it would be, it's really very fitting, because we've seen before, in the same way that the square represents matter and material consciousness, that we can't build anything without the square, or measure anything without the square, or test anything without the square. That's a clear representation of material consciousness, whereas the circle represents spirit, which is endless. It has no beginning, no end. It goes on and on. And so the idea is similar to what we've been looking at all along. There is a good deal of evidence, if you really want to get into the esoteric things, to indicate that the whole story of the round table is sidereal in nature, in that the great bear isn't the great bear or the small bear that's called Arthur's wain. It's the great bear. It's called Arthur's wagon. And the Arcturus is the star that represents every year. Either way, it works in that there would be changing stars at different times. This is something that is not completely new. It's something that goes way, way back as far as we have right now in material scholarship, as far as we have records of astronomy. The oldest records of astronomy that are now currently extant are in China. And in China, they call the pole star the Emperor. Like I'm skipping half the word. The Emperor represented was represented by the pole star because everybody circled around it and it remained constant. But the pole star was called by the Chinese not only the pole star, but it was called the second star of the auxiliary sphere. And the Grand Emperor, I can spell grand, the Grand Emperor was the pole of the ecliptic. And so in the same way that empires change with regard to the pole stars changed with regard to the Grand Emperor, and that meant a change of dynasty rather than a change of empire. So that a lot of what seems like history in ancient Chinese literature is actually astronomy, astrology, and cosmology. So when they're talking about different philosophers or different emperors and such like that, they're talking about periods of consciousness in history. They're related to very mundane history, but it is also allegorical to something that is deeply spiritual. On the other hand, the whole of the Arthurian stories is based to a large extent on a lot of zodiacal things in England. Like, for example, Merlin was reputed to have removed what we now call Stonehenge from Ireland, to have brought all the stones over from Ireland and put it on the plain in England. And that's one of the astronomical artifacts or the zodiacal artifacts, and supposedly from above you could see the figures of different animals associated with the Stonehenge. Moreover, a lot of the action takes place in western England, near the border of Wales and Britain itself, in an area near Glastonbury. And if you're familiar with Glastonbury's cathedral, I have a very excellent book in my library, but there are quite a few other ones now that have come out since then, showing that the Glastonbury cathedral and all the parts of it are based on the zodiac. So that when you're in the cathedral in certain areas, that this is associated with this sign, that's associated with that sign. So the whole idea then is that this is on one level a very grand sidereal thing, a zodiacal myth, and even greater, an esoteric myth associated with the changing of pole stars, because it's sort of like the things that happen at the equator on the Earth are associated with exotericism, and our astrology, as wonderful as it is very exoteric, whereas the things that happen at the pole are associated with esotericism. In fact, I think we mentioned this before, that there are two different kinds of migrations, in that form migrates from the equator toward the poles, and form is at its highest in that when our little kitty cats elsewhere are lions and tigers at the equator, and the large animals can survive arrive near the equator where they become extincted in the northern reaches. And like right now, what we call sweet corn, or the field corn that we eat, is migrating from the equator northward. And some evolutionists believe that now that there is becoming less and less water, that there's another kind of form that is evolving from the equator toward the poles, and that is the succulents. It is a different form of chlorophyll. I think they use an O3 rather than an O2 chlorophyll, but I'm not, it's not a quotable statement. And the succulents are now moving more and more away from the equator. On the other hand, what comes down from the poles is spiritual knowledge, and the idea of a Shangri-La common to many societies was always associated with a polar society. Okay, now, in the Round Table, the equality was that there were laws that applied to each and every member of the Round Table. Each member of the Round Table was sworn to help each other. And they were sworn to help the world or the country in a strict moral Christian code of behavior, which applied to all of them. And the members of the Round Table were sworn to divide their time between armory or warrior pursuits and monastic pursuits, that a part of their time they were supposed to retreat. Many of them retreated from the from the warrior pursuits only when things forced them to, like they were laying siege to, or they went mad, or they became very ill, or something like that. So there is this theme of equality that runs through all of the Arthurian stories. Now, the other thing about the Arthurian stories, or the Round Table myths, and that is there is an extreme polarity and dichotomy. I don't know how to say it. That there was, for every attempt at unity, there was something that went against it. And this is that at the table itself, each knight had a chair that was specially for that chair, and he always sat in. So even though there was equality around there, each person had their own chair. In fact, their names were etched in the chair. And there was one special chair that no one was allowed to sit in, or you could try to sit in it if you wanted to, because it was supposed to be for the greatest of all knights. It was called Siege Perilous. And anybody who sat into that chair that was not the greatest and purest and the flower of all knighthood came, as they say, to great trouble. And we're going to talk about Siege Perilous later on, because that's part of what we're talking about. So there was that kind of specialism, and many of the chairs were reserved for years until somebody showed up, and then they fit right in, and that was their chair. So at the same time as there's equality, there is a lot of division. Now, as much as it was a very great joy and a very great honor, it was a world-known honor, at least in their world, which went as far as Eastern Europe, to belong to the Round Table. It was also very difficult. There was something like, as we know, we've talked about initiation, that before we can pass into the spiritual world, we have to face or confront that of ourselves, which is a compositive of all of our unredeemed evil. And in facing that unredeemed evil and saying, and being humbled by it and saying, yes, I have done that, and in conscientiously redeeming that through creative activity in service, is what the whole initiatory process is about. And in facing that unredeemed evil, we actually extract the experience from it, or the essence of the experience, which gives us the soul power to be initiated and leave our bodies and travel into the spiritual world. That activity of facing our unredeemed evil is what is still present in fraternities and things like that as hazing. And there was something like a hazing at the beginning of one's commitment to the round table, that when one committed to the life of the round table, at least for the first 10 days, one had an extremely difficult trial, or in those 10 days was introduced to a trial that perhaps lasted all the rest of their life. So it was not an easy thing, and it was an extremely rigorous life, the knight's life. And there was a duty not only to do good deeds and not only to live a deeply spiritual life, but to follow whatever experience came along. Now, another quality about quest myths, and about especially the Arthurian myth that is unlike any that we've seen so far, is that it's generational. That is, the knight's stories carried through 3 generations of older kings of the original Arthurian round table, and then the younger generation of knights. Now, most myths don't carry on over several generations like that. And this shows this to be a really advanced myth that comes extremely close to history. In fact, it's written as though it were history. And it's really beautiful because it shows the progress, or it shows also the rise and fall of a society, because the round table did not endure. And so it shows a lot of evolutionary characteristics, which is what life is like. You know, we get better all the time, but in some ways our life we come to a physical maturity and then enter into decadence. And the polarity shows up in this character of the Arthurian story also because there are great struggles between the different generations, the youngsters and the oldsters, and we know eventually that Arthur is killed by his own son, and that's the end of the whole story. Is another quality about the Arthurian stories is that they are extremely self-conscious in their emphasis on morals, ethics, social improvement, and spiritual improvement. In this regard, it stands apart from almost any other myth that I can think of. In no other myth is there that much focus on what is a right life. Certainly the Heracles myth didn't have anything like that, nor Susan Oliver. They were both sort of brutes. But this is a myth where all of the heroes, all of the knights, are striving for something that is beyond attainment, though they try to live their lives in accordance with it completely. And that is not only their own honor, but it is a value system, and it's something for society. There are places again and again where the world around them is improved. And in the section that we're going to look into in the Sangreal, a lot of the values are extremely spiritual. In fact, there's a great dichotomy in this also. There is a dichotomy between the personal values of honor and some of the spiritual values of humility. And so the dichotomy of one value system placed against another is very, very pronounced. The Christian value of the myth is also pitted against another big problem of the struggle between being true to the pure spiritual ideal and the personal laws, which brings out a very central theme. One of the central themes of the whole thing is the issue of sex. Arthur himself was born of a cuckolding, and his entire married life, or most of his entire married life, he was a victim of cuckolding. And his son, Mordred, is the result of an unfaithful union with a stepsister or with a half-sister. So the whole issue of sexuality and sexual faithfulness is something that goes all the way through the whole thing. The whole idea of love versus passion, and the idea of sexual indulgence versus chastity, and especially toward the end, the concept of virginity. You're going to see this come up again and again and again. You can see that all of these things are meant to change the consciousness of society at the time, and they still do it to this day. Another of the central themes is the theme of illusion and reality. There are lots of incidents that occur where the outer illusions appear to be one thing and the inner reality appears to be another thing, and the knights learn sometimes by painful experiences to differentiate between the outer illusion and the inner reality. Isn't that the theme of illusion itself has a lot of sub-themes, because there is good illusion and bad illusion, and there's even malignant illusion, and there's intentional illusion, and all of those things. As spiritual students, we don't know all about those things, like our magical demonstration, only illusion, or are they necessary at all, or anything like that. Another theme is the theme of true versus false honor, and true versus illusionary love, all of those sorts of things. We can go on and on, but those are the basic things. I told you it's going to be very abstract and very short. That those are the basic kinds of themes and characteristics involved in the myth. So let's introduce very quickly several hundred years of several hundred pages of Arthurian Nights. We'll look at the times, the places, and people. The myth takes place approximately around the 5th and 6th century A.D. And it is primarily among the Gallic nations of Europe. That is Ireland, Wales, Cornwallis, Britain, West Britain in France, Belgium, which was inhabited by the Celtic Belgae, and Gaul, which is what they still refer to France as. So this whole area was the land that a few hundred years before was the land of the Druidical Celts. And shortly before the time of Christ, it was dominated by the Romans, which is described very well in Caesar's History of the Gallic Wars and Tacitus's Britannica. Talks about the Druids and their blue face and all of that. What is happening at this time historically is that the Roman Empire is crumbling and is withdrawing from these areas. Pressure on the Roman Empire and also on this former Gallic Empire is coming from the north and east in the form of mostly the Germanic tribes, and among them mostly the Saxons. In the north, the Scots have already overthrown the Picts, and it's that period in history it's a time when a strong influence is being withdrawn and there's a lot of chaos. It's also the period that it could be called the Dark Ages, because the Roman culture or the classical culture was dying away, and in its place the Christian culture had not come to the fore yet. At this time, the only place that there was much culture at all was in North Africa and in the Middle East, in the Islamic peoples. Even before Muhammad, there was culture in Africa and the Middle East. This is also a period that marks the beginning of feudalism. And so the whole myth is filled with many, many petty kings, and there are a lot of warriors and a lot of bandits and things like that. So politically and culturally, there was need for a strong central government, something to give culture, something to give protection, something to give human decency, and this is what the Arthurian myth is about in a political, historical sense. It is an attempt or an activity to produce a unified nation after the strong Romans had left. Clearly, the Gallic peoples, the Celtic peoples, could not reassert themselves. That culture was dying, and a lot of the religion was dying with it, and Christianity still hadn't really developed yet. And so that's what is involved. Paganism was going into a very degenerate state. It became nothing but a dark form of magic. So Christianity is just beginning to find one of its cultural expressions. The inner esoteric spiritual side of Christianity is pretty much constant throughout history, but the outer expressions are now finding a way to be made. And in these nations which still rebelled against Rome, they also rebelled against paganism. And so there needed to be something more of a spirit of independence that later characterized Protestantism, because one of the impulses of Christianity was to bring people to much greater individuation. In the ancient classical world, heroes did everything. Champions did everything. Like you'd have one champion would fight the whole battle for everybody else. The whole of the Trojan War was fought mostly among noblemen. It wasn't the foot soldiers that did most of the fighting. It was the champions that did most of the fighting. Now, with the rise of Christianity, there was a stronger individuation among everyone, and so there needed to be something that allowed, again, the equality of the round table and allowed strong individuals to develop without having to be under the thumb of Catholicism and that very heavily repressive kind of form that it took. So the Arthurian myth satisfied all of these things. The time of the Arthurian myth has something very special about it, because remember we talked about the Golden Fleece quest. By the precession of the equinox, the beginning of the Pisces age was about 496. So in the same way that 2100, 2200 years earlier, Jason and the Argonauts went for the Golden Fleece, and everything then changed from the religion of the bull. Everything then changed the religion of the ram or the lamb or the sheep, and the quest of the Golden Fleece represented the change for that. At the time of the Arthurian Knights, it became the quest of the wine goblet. Just what you'd expect with Pisces. It is the quest for a wine goblet, and so that it represented a time of moving into a whole new epoch, an epoch that was to be marked by great humility, because the people even valued humility above cleanliness.